All right, folks, welcome to the last breakout session of the day. And back by popular demand, we have Candace Pelt and Eric Wells from the Oregon Department of Education. The topic of this breakout session is Universal Design for Learning. And with that, welcome back, Candace.
Thank you, Krista. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back to this session. Coming in, thinking about universal design for learning. An overview and context of this is really going to be a high-level intro into it. And so if you are deep into UDL already and you've been in these practices, this is likely going to be a review for you. If you've never heard of this, or the first time you saw it was when you saw the requirements in distance learning for all and you said, I have no idea what those letters mean, this should be helpful information. UDL is a concept that has been alive and well for a long time. We're going to talk about how it interplays both in educational landscape and what happens, as well as the requirements that currently live in comprehensive distance learning, which many of us are finding ourselves as we're thinking about the requirements and the state metrics for opening, having to support and create plans for comprehensive distance learning, and UDL is a tenet of that and a foundational piece. So understanding what that looks like is helpful in this. It's also important to understand that it's a framework, it's not a playbook. And so what you're going to get is really an idea of how to start to implement this. And you might be thinking, I don't know what that means yet, right? And so know that you're not going to walk away with exact tools of what that looks like, because it's really conceptualized within the frame of the classroom or a specific lesson. We'll give you some ideas and some resources and some tools of where to get that. And I would encourage you to keep reaching out to Eric, to myself, and we have some partners at the department who teach courses on UDL, who design lessons for it, and who have really deep knowledge of this. We also have partners in the field who've spent a lot of time working with CAST, who is the organization who originally founded the concept of universal design for learning as an educational component. And so we have lots of partners we can connect people with.
And so as Candace shared, our objectives today are to introduce basic concepts about universal design for learning, and then to illustrate a little about how the UDL approach can help all students access content in ways that are effective for them. And so we're doing this in the context of comprehensive distance learning, because we know that many of you will at least start your school years in that instructional model. And we wanted to talk a little bit at the outset. A recent email we got from a parent stuck with me, and it recentered for me why it's critical that as a state we provide strong guidance and ongoing support for schools and district staff, and that we learn together how to best support all students in making progress. So last month, a parent emailed the department and let us know that her son experiences autism and a developmental delay, and that he wasn't able to use a computer to access instruction. And so distance learning for all last spring was inaccessible to the student. And so from the parent's perspective, she said she was watching her son wither. And so we've intentionally paired this quote with a picture of children because they're the heart of everything that we do as educators. And as I look at the children on the screen, I wonder, which of these children are we willing to let wither? Which of those children who may have struggled under distance learning for all are we willing to continue to watch struggle as we enter a new school year? And knowing the hearts of so many amazing teachers, of administrators and school staff, my hypothesis would be that the answer is none. I don't think there's an educator in this room, I don't think there's an educator in this state who is willing that any of their kids struggle to access comprehensive distance learning. It's a new challenge for all of us, but educators are superheroes who will do anything they can to help kids. It's why we get into this field, it's why we get into this work. And so what I would posit as we start this year is that what we can do in order that our kids don't struggle is lean into universal design for learning. Think deeply about it, study it, and try it. Iterate and improve your universally designed lessons and practices to ensure that each of these kids on your screen, each of the kids in our hearts, all of our students will be able to access and meaningfully engage with off-site learning experiences. Think about the supports that might help the student here that this parent is saying withered in distance learning for all, and know that whatever supports we put in place to help that student are also beneficial to others. Because the beauty of UDL is that the options that we build in to help one learner because of their needs also prove helpful to other learners because of different needs or different preferences. And so the classic example that we use when we're talking about universal design is one of curb cutaways. And so architecture, where UDL kind of emerged out of universal design in architecture, at some point along the way said, we need to make sidewalks accessible for people who use wheelchairs, and they built curb cutaways into them. But I can tell you that as a father, I have more than once benefited when I was pushing a stroller and had a curb cutaway to get up onto the sidewalk. And universal design for learning is the same mindset brought into education and into our teaching learning experiences. When we design for accessibility from the start, everyone benefits from that design.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think that's the foundational part of UDL, right? It was really rooted in the physical landscape and layout and architecture and curb cutouts and ramps or other examples, right? That we know that it's intended, and some people must have them for access to be able to access a second floor if they can't walk up the stairs, but other people benefit from it, right? The same structure applies to universal design for learning, which is a truly amazing way to sell it when you're talking to your teachers, when you're talking to people who are struggling or who have historically thought about differentiation and how they had to plan a lesson first, and then I've got to go differentiate for all my different learners. Right? So this is an easier way to do it, which is a win-win, because you get more bang for the buck, you get to support more learners, and your teachers are going to feel less overwhelmed when they start to embrace this concept of how to ramp up UDL. Eric, if there's an opportunity, if you can put the slides in the chat here, some people are having trouble downloading them from the app.
I can do that.
What UDL is, thank you, is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning. It's really thinking from the outside in, from the furthest stretch in the margins of the students who are typically your learners that are struggling to access what's in the middle. Instead of planning a lesson like we have historically done, we think about, you know, our ways that we were taught in my generation as a teacher to think about lessons. You designed a lesson and then you thought about how to differentiate, right? So you designed for the core, for the middle. What UDL does is it stretches our thinking and asks us to think first about the edges, to consider those as we're planning. Instead of trying to stretch the middle, we become like more round because we're able to take from the outside, and then every learner's needs across the spectrum are met in that. So UDL is based on scientific insights into how humans learn, and we know that this is true for multiple learners. So while it's required for some, many benefit, right? So this is an added win for multiple situations. It's an approach for creating instructional goals and methods, and it supports multiple learners. The principles are engagement, representation, action, and expression. So you're going to hear a lot today, multiple means of. So when I say multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action, that's really the foundational roots of UDL. So the why, the what, and the how, when we think about a lesson, that when we're designing something and we're creating it, the why would students be engaged? Why do they want to connect? And I need to think about multiple ways, multiple means that I can access their engagement, especially now in an online platform where many of them are going to have different scenarios and situations. Learning at home in Eric's house with his children is much different than learning in my house, and the conditions are different. And so even though we have highly educated, dominant language, access to tech, all of that, so a lot of the conditions should be the same, the learning environment is radically different. So even within that static group that I just described, like, there is a learning need and a shift in that. So we really want to consider all of those options. And then if we start to layer in houselessness, we layer in poverty, we layer in disability, we start adding all the complexities of how learning becomes a challenge. The foundations of UDL give us that wide range to say, we're going to plan lessons thinking about how all of these learners can access the components of this.
And I would add, most of the things, the differences that Candace talked about there are environmental differences, not differences that inhere in the learners themselves. And so it's critical when we think about how to adapt that we think about how to change the environment. But what we've known and what we've learned to be true is, well, we've told ourselves for a long time in education that there is some kind of middle of the road average student. That is not a true statement. David Rose, who was one of the founders of CATS and a pioneer in universal design for learning, talked about each of our neurological makeups as far as how we learn and engage with the learning process is as distinct and unique as our fingerprints. And so when we think about that, if it's the case that my profile as a learner is as distinct and unique as my fingerprint as a person, it becomes really hard and problematic to try to design lessons and learning for that average person, because we can't take all of our different fingerprints and come up with what an average fingerprint looks like. And so UDL gives us a framework to navigate all of those different learner profiles in ways that allow and make learning accessible to every student, regardless of the differences between them. But as important as it is to talk about what UDL is, it's also important to talk about what it's not. And so the first thing that we would name there is that components of UDL have to be built into school culture. They have to be built into lesson plans, and it has to be from the start. It's not a differentiation like Candace talked about. It's not a set or a separate set or a special set of privileges for a select few, chosen few group of students. It's the framing from which we can ensure that all students are able to benefit and that all learners are the chosen ones. Okay, it's also not about watering down content. Presenting information through multiple means, encouraging different ways to demonstrate knowledge and skills does not compromise academic rigor. To the contrary, it allows students to successfully access and engage with demanding and rigorous content. And so I think about it with like students who are struggling to read because they don't have a lot of interest in whatever book they've come across. And then inevitably you come to that one book, for my son it was Harry Potter, that just sparks a really big interest in it. And it pushed his reading ability beyond that, which it would be able to be with other stories, because he was deeply engaged and deeply connected to the work. And so UDL provides us frameworks that we can bring that level of engagement and passion and hard work into the learning experience for all learners all the time. And so it can be a catalyst for deep learning. It's also not an intervention. It is not one specific thing that we do in order to fix educational programs. It's not a panacea that's going to solve all the problems you're going to face this school year, but it will give you a framework that you can use to apply when you're trying to solve those problems. I will add one other thing. It's not on the slide, but it's worth noting that UDL is also not a technological solution. Okay, it is not something that happens in digital learning. It is mode of education neutral. It can be applied to technological and digital learning. It can be applied entirely to offline learning. And so it's important as we think about, especially with so many of our schools starting in comprehensive distance learning, and a number of them who will not be able to fully replicate the learning experience through digital means, that does not rule out UDL for you. It can still be used no matter whether, regardless of whether your learning is online or offline.
Yeah, I think the only addition I would add in that is that it's a requirement under CDL. So most people are sitting in that spot having to grapple with that now. So really, we just found ourselves over the last few weeks, the landscape shifting again around us, right? And it's jarring and it's jolting. And a lot of us are trying to navigate what we thought was going to be one condition for schools to open. We've learned there's something new. And so as we're learning and shifting it, we offer that UDL can be really a frame to help your teachers. And so you have a lot of work you're going to be doing on providing support and instructional supports built in for your staff, for your teams to think about planning lessons. And UDL can kind of weather through each of those models. So as you're shifting from CDL to on-site or limited person instruction, that this can be a frame that holds through it. And so something to consider in that. So the 3 parts I talked about that really live within UDL principles. So each of them, it's multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. So at the heart of it, each lesson or each concept, that you have an objective that students are going to achieve. They're going to obtain some level of standard or knowledge where you're going to clarify that. The task of the teacher then is to say, if this is the goal and the target, I'm backwards planning this and I'm thinking about how am I going to create engagement for that? In my typical structure, it would look like this. If I'm going to talk about multiple means, each layer then has 2 or 3 options. So the teacher creates for this one objective or lesson 2 to 3 different ways for students to access it, which seems so hard in the beginning. And it seems really, really difficult to, it feels like 9 times the work because you have 3 in each one, right? Except what you find is that it replicates itself over and over and over in lessons, and teachers get really adept and really good at finding new ways. And they also find that learners pick up new ways of sharing the information, right? And accessing. If they thought before, like, oh, I'm better at reading this information, but they find through multiple means of engagement, a different way that prints closer to their own learning style. UDL and student supports. UDL requires firm goals for all learners, right? It's a really high mark and establishes clarity of the standard and the objective. It has achievement for all learners that are maintained as the expectation, that there's no exemption, that there's no threshold, there's no bottom saying, we're good if we get to 70%, or we're good if we get to 80. That the tenets of UDL really take everything that we believe foundationally in education and say, all learners matter and nobody's left behind. And so it creates appropriate conditions for supports and accommodations when they're needed, and talks about and removes unnecessary barriers to learning. So we're going to show some examples in a little bit here of what are potential barriers in typical lessons and structures, and how would those be removed.
And so when we look at the different UDL principles and we talk about the what of learning, tied to how we present lesson content, as a teacher, we need to provide flexible ways of what that lesson content is so that students have options about how they're learning. We need to provide flexible methods of expression and assessment so that students have choices as to how they demonstrate their knowledge, and flexible options for engagement so students have choices that meet their interest needs. And so where we really start to see the power of UDL is because each of those pathways, the multiple means of engagement, of representation, and action and expression, have guidelines for that, how we can build those pathways as a teacher, and then specific strategies within them that can be used to provide options to students. And so if you look at this chart that kind of overviews the UDL guidelines, you'll note that multiple means of engagement has different concepts in it. It says recruiting interest, sustaining effort and persistence, and self-regulation. And then representation too has 3 different categories within it, and expression has categories within it. And then within each of those concepts, teachers can use specific strategies to support a student's individual neurological makeup. And the work of coming to understanding UDL well is coming to understand how to employ those strategies in ways that support all students and every student. And so that's obviously not work that we're going to be able to unpack and help make everybody masters of within an hour. It takes a lot of time, a lot of investment in it, and it gets easier over time. But I will share a couple of examples of what these strategies could look like across a variety of content areas. And so as a means of fostering collaboration and communication in order to support sustained effort and persistence, so one of our multiple means of engagement, teachers can provide role cards. And this may not be something new for you. And so that emphasizes for us that UDL is not necessarily a fundamental rethinking of pedagogical methods. There are lots of wonderful things that teachers have done for years, separately and discretely. What UDL does is ties it together into a framework that provides pathways for all learners to access materials. And so role cards as an instructional tool can be used to support small groups by assigning or allowing students to choose the specific roles that they want to take on as they're working their way through collaborative projects. And so that helps students because then they have specific tasks or behaviors that are expected of them, and because we can individualize them based off of student learning styles and strengths. And so that's one way, one strategy that we can use as teachers in order to provide students with clear, tangible ways to actively engage with content in our classrooms. Another example that I'll give you is under looking at options for language and symbols, so representation of mathematical expressions. We want to use multiple representations in order to help students access information in a way that makes sense to their brains. And so multiple representations allow students to see the same mathematical expression or a relationship presented in more than one format. So it might be through words or verbal representations. We might use pictures or graphs or tables of values, or we might use symbolic representations like the expressions and equations math teachers are familiar with. And so algebra tiles, manipulatives are examples of different possible representations we could use for mathematical concepts. And so I share these not as exemplars of prescriptive steps we have to take in order to do UDL, but as examples and possibilities within the broad menu of how do we allow for student voice and choice in their education, and to let you know that it's not a fundamental difference of like, now I have to go relearn and rethink about teaching generally, but rather how do we tie it all together in a framework that works for all learners.
So we know that UDL, I've shared, it lives in comprehensive distance learning. If you look at the required components of it, it's one of the structural pieces that when we think about academic conditions of teaching and learning, that's where it lives as a foundational. It's also embedded into Ready School Safe Learners in sections 4 through 8 when you think about bringing students back on site. And so really knowing and understanding what this looks like will be helpful in multiple ways as you go through this. If you hear push on, you know, like, why are we doing this? This isn't important. It's really talking about the why and the benefits of it should sell itself, but also knowing that it's a requirement that lives deep within all of these documents, it will be an important part to move forward. So comprehensive distance learning and universal design for learning. Right? So under CDL, which many of us are finding ourselves in that space again, the requirements explicitly teach expectations and engagement, allow for asynchronous engagement. There's a number of pieces of information around how synchronous and asynchronous engagement can live and work together. Really teacher facilitated and teacher led and focused is critical in this. And that we know that what we don't want to replicate if we did an all synchronous model, for example, is a straight 7-period day where a student's sitting in front of the Zoom camera, you know, for 6 hours in a row with scheduled classes, and we're essentially remodeling what happened in our schools. And so to do that or to achieve it, we have to be able to think about project-based learning. We have to be able to think about different ways that students can capture and engage in their own learning, and that's paired with teacher-led and teacher-facilitated learning. So it's both synchronous and asynchronous. What's also not allowable under CDL in these conditions, which UDL supports, is it can't just be put all the lessons on a Google platform and allow the student to independently access them, which is really the equivalent to a digital worksheet or a digital packet, right, with no support and no feedback. So those aren't going to be allowable examples. So either fully synchronous where they're just locked in, or the digital worksheet, right? What we want to find and what we're trying to strive for with UDL is that balance of the learning experience that focuses on the student, on their specific needs, on really pairing and honing in on what are the requirements for the course, what are the goals, and then weeding out some of that other things. We know that with UDL, you can assign note takers and people can have different roles. We can make all the materials accessible for multiple learners. We can embrace our students as teachers, and that teaching each other gives the greatest clarity and the greatest support in that, and that they should be teaching us continually. And that they're actively building a supportive community. UDL creates conditions where every learner is embraced, instead of the learners that get to access the information and then knowing that there's some students that just don't get it, right? So UDL creates a community support system that's just different.
And so as you're thinking through how each of these might play out in your schools and your classrooms across the school year, we would encourage you to look at Oregon Open Educational Resources as a place where we can build our collective capacity around UDL, because this is a site that we set up at somewhere around the start of Distance Learning for All to begin to build resources by which we could represent concepts in different ways. And so intentionally designed to be supportive of UDL. And so we would strongly recommend, as we're struggling with and thinking about how do we build our UDL capacity and our distance learning capacity, that we find that we use a central repository so that we can not just be trying to figure it out in our own brains, but leverage the collective brilliance of our colleagues as we try to do this difficult work. And so the next several slides talk a little bit about how traditional materials can introduce barriers into the learning process for students, and then how we can use UDL processes to overcome those barriers. As a disclaimer, the content on the next several slides come from the IRIS UDL module that's linked in the slides. And I would strongly recommend folks to go and think about that. IRIS is like a just-in-time learning platform brought out of the Peabody School at Vanderbilt University, and they have some really good high-quality content related to UDL, but also related to lots of areas in special education particularly. And so we strongly recommend that. But when we think about this set of content in the module, they're talking about an archaeology unit. And so one of the materials they use in that is a textbook chapter. And when we think about the barriers that textbooks bring and introduce into the learning process, they require that as a student I can see, that I can decode and comprehend written text, and that I can process the visual information that comes in that textbook, okay? If we're doing lectures as part of that unit, it requires that I can hear, that I can identify the key points that are coming in that lecture, that I can process the oral information that's coming at me, and that I'm physically and cognitively able to take notes. All of those could be barriers that keep me from accessing that material in the way that it's represented. You know, and if there's a video on archaeological finds, it requires that I can see and hear what's on the screen, and that I can process that visual and oral information. And so all of those introduce potential barriers that could hinder my ability to access the learning content.
So an example of those instructional methods, so the traditional one is students learn independently by reading their textbook. So what it highlights for us is the barriers to that. We know that for generations in education, when a teacher says, read chapter 3, come back and we'll talk about it later, very little learning happens in that. That's not new to anybody in this. And so I think it's trying to take this concept and bridge it a little further. So learning independently, right, from a textbook requires understanding the content, regardless of background knowledge, and being able to extract relevant information. And many of us are experiencing this ourselves. I would say when we are reading the health metrics on reopening, and how many times we had to reread it, we had to look at somebody, we had to ask somebody, we had to think about, right, how do we apply this now? Because we're taking information and trying to make it applicable. And so we're all engaging in that learning process. The same scenario should be created for our students, where we create the conditions of not just handing them information and then saying, this is what you've got, but we create opportunities for sense making, for clarity, for question and answer, and for application of that. Because the more we go through that process, we're able to break down those barriers. During classroom lectures, if you're providing just lectures, even in the virtual format digitally, it requires students to be able to learn by limited examples provided by the teacher or the book, and identify key ideas. And like Eric shared, be physically or cognitively able to take notes and distill those notes and information. During whole group instruction, so if we're saying this is a synchronous class and you're pulling everybody together for a 20-minute video on finds, followed with a class discussion, it requires a student to be able to participate in whole class discussion. Whole group instruction usually targets the middle, not the whole class. And so what you would start to do is think about how you break that apart, how you make small group instruction accessible, how you use the features of that, how you partner students up, and how they can apply that learning in different ways to get away from just that whole group instruction.
So a question came in the chat, Candace, that I'll read aloud. Talks about UDL being a means for students to demonstrate their learning in multiple ways, and then assessment must also be flexible. So are there models for rubrics that track different modes of presenting learning to measure and assessments, and then how students will be prepared for statewide assessments?
Yeah, I would share the website that Eric shared has tons of information on the Oregon Learning site that they've been compiling and gathering on this, and multiple means of formative assessment that tracks and provides opportunity for learning and enhances the learning experience. Also, when we talk about assessment of a tool in this, as you dig into UDL, it does provide multiple means of assessment or multiple means of sharing how you know the information, right? So a student can create multiple demonstrative ways to share the information. That's not always the typical response, especially in our secondary schools. Our elementary teachers generally go to that anyway, where they already know, like, okay, if you're not able to do this, I'm going to try and get it out of you this way. Like, I'm going to work through that. What we see more in our secondary schools is a really structured kind of way around that. So UDL creates a framework to say, okay, if you're teaching algebra and you typically assess learning in this way, we're going to ask you to consider 2 or 3 other ways to assess the student learning experience, right? As it relates to statewide assessments, I think, yeah, that's a huge conversation, and many of us, right, if we had the ability to remove assessment, we would independently. As SBAC currently sits in our ESSA application and it's a federal requirement, it's not something that the state has the ability to remove independently. In distance learning for all, when we had a waiver, we did apply for it.
What I will share about statewide assessments, though, and the impact of UDL on it, while it may not change the multiple means of action and expression tied to the SBAC itself, if we can use UDL concepts throughout the school year, we get deeper, better learning, and therefore students are better able to show that what they know on the assessment. And so it doesn't fix the barriers associated with the statewide standardized assessments themselves, but it does help increase the amount of knowledge that students have, which can then translate to better results on those assessments. And so what we start to see is when we look at the promise of UDL, so we talked about the barriers that are created by trying to have students learn by independently reading their textbook. If we were taking that from a UDL approach, we would then instead start by beginning and building, activating background knowledge, asking questions by related experiences in whole group instruction, pre-teaching vocabulary prior to assigning the text, so we give students the framework that they can then access that text from. And we would also have multiple means of representation by presenting the content through different media and different formats, like audio through lectures, images and video, and manipulatives through different models that we might use.
Yeah, Eric, if you can keep going, I will find some of this information in the chat.
Sorry, I was trying to click on the button. They hide on me sometimes. When we talk about traditional instructional methods during classroom lecture, we have a teacher summarizing information from the textbook. Under a UDL approach, we might give multiple examples of important concepts or objects. We might highlight important information in the way that we speak or share things. We might say, hey, here's a key concept for you. Or we might write down important words or concepts on the board. And then we can scaffold and support by providing an outline that has the key ideas highlighted to accompany the lecture going along with the content. And during whole group instruction, when we talk about that 20-minute video on archaeology, we can follow it up with a class discussion that we can use flexible grouping for. And so then we can meet with small groups and engage more directly with students. Much like when we think about all of the Zoom meetings we've been on lately, we tend to use a lot of breakout rooms at ours because that allows me to engage with 3 or 4 people instead of the 80 who are in this room right now. We can provide adjustable levels of challenge and corrective feedback during those small group sessions in ways that we can't with the whole group at a time. And we can allow alternatives for students to express or demonstrate their learning by having them create picture stories or models as opposed to necessarily writing a lot of text or expository information. And so as we work our way through that, we wanted to kind of open it up for conversations and things that you've been thinking about as we've gone through this content, and we're wondering what squared with prior knowledge for you, things that you already knew coming into this session. What's something that presented a new angle on something you might have already known? What do you want to circle back with your team? And how can we, from ODE's lens, support you in developing and implementing UDL practices within your school or district? And so please feel free to unmute and share some thoughts about these topics if you have them, and we'll have a brief conversation about that. And so particularly from my own selfish lens, what I would be most curious to know about is the support for UDL practices that ODE can offer. If you have ideas on what that might look like, one of the things that we're very committed to this year is we know that it's going to be foundationally and fundamentally different to be in schools for the 2021 school year. And we have an obligation and responsibility to support an excellent education for every student across the state. And so what are ways that we could partner with you to make sure that, you know, that this becomes something, a means of being in your school, as opposed to just one more hour-long COSA presentation I went and listened to.
Yeah, and Kendra, you know, exactly. I think it's very similar to SciUp or constructing meaning in our secondary schools, where we think about, you know, accessible language and why that's important and critical, and how this can benefit multiple learners in the same way, right? When we did SciUp, it was that, you know, it was required for our students who needed language support, and so many students benefited when we started practicing that. So I agree, Kendra.
So there's a question, Candace, I'll let you take a shot at, from Karen in there about the time commitment associated with creating thorough UDL lessons, and how do we find the time to create UDL aligned lessons when we already don't even know what we're teaching or how we're teaching. There's so many questions about the upcoming school year.
Yeah, Karen, it's a really good example. And like everything that we pick up and learn with teachers, what I recommend and what I have seen a lot of success with is picking the lessons that, you know, even if you think things are going to be moving, you probably have a lesson in mind, something that you have taught, that you've taught a couple times, that you have some success with, and taking that and saying, okay, let me package that in this with the tenets on CAST and say, if multiple means of engagement, how could I engage kids multiple times through that? Multiple means of representation. That just means how could they share that information with me, right? And so as you go through each of those, take it in small chunks instead of saying like every lesson has to be UDL right now and I have to have that really clear. Take it with like your biggest bang for the buck, right? Starting that way, and then you build a lot of muscle around it and things become naturalized and normal for you in that. And if you're an administrator that's new to this concept or thinking about teaching this to your teams, there's tons and tons of free information on CAST website. I put in the chat for Landon. They have videos, they have trainings. There are people that just do this professionally, routinely. We have people at the department. If you reach out to us, we can hook them up to do a training with your staff, you know, free of charge. Just connect with us. This is really important information that we want to see move through. I think it's an important concept, and it's one that can, like so many things, if we can shift our mind, it can make things easier, right? And if we can harness that instead of thinking about it's one more thing to learn and do, it's like, oh, if I do that and I can get some momentum in it, it makes all of the conditions on what I'm doing for engaging my kids feel better and different, which can move us further faster. Some teachers, Nina, some teachers transition to CDL feel quite challenging. Absolutely, yeah. And it's definitely, anytime we train teachers on anything, right? So as a principal, when I was a principal or when I was in the central office, it's so much about how you package it and you present it and you make it real and applicable. Because like Eric shared, like I've never worked with a teacher that didn't want the very best for the kids they were serving. But the conditions around them create noise and create frustration and angst and anxiety. And so our job is to make sure if we're doing or designing professional learning experiences for them, that we create pathways that are really easy for them to map onto, giving them some concrete examples, saying, let's just take one lesson and let's do it together. Let's try it, teach it, let's see how it goes. Give each other some coaching and feedback. More likely, you're gonna have teachers already who've been doing this on their own, who have very similar concepts that they've been mapping onto that are like, oh yeah, the UDL thing, I've been watching and doing that, right? And so you're gonna have lots of people in your groups already that can be good resources for that. Kendra, we would love it. We absolutely, the more we can support, our partners in OTLA have been deep in this with us also. And so this is a joint effort for sure, because this doesn't live in special education or language service. This is like everything we do in teaching, right?
Right, and I can't, so to Eric's question, I can't think of exactly what I need it to look like right now, but I'm just kind of processing all of this, and I will absolutely be in touch with you both.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I think what we can end with was, this is the last session. Krista, I'm not sure that there is a presentation after this. Is there a whole group? No. So this is your end of day. So we're going to do a farewell for you. And what I want to start with and remind everybody that this is August and we are deep in the throes of planning for what we normally are so excited about, which is kids back in our space, and they bring us joy and hope and happiness. And now we're thinking, man, more of what drove me crazy in the spring. So I want to acknowledge and honor that, and I want to leave everybody with, there is hope in this, and there is definite potential for us to go and grow our students in this capacity. The new world around us that's been created is not something any of us would have chosen or planned, but we do have the ability to create conditions for our learners to make it really, really successful, to start a school year where even with the noise of COVID, they can feel connected, they can feel loved, they can feel like they are learners. So I encourage you, take that with your heart, take it with all of the passion that you have every fall anyway, and set aside all of the frustration and just say like, okay, we're gonna lean in. We're gonna lean into supporting kids and making sure that they have the most excellent and amazing back to school. Thank you everybody for everything you do. Tremendous educators and leaders in Oregon. And so we are so humbled and grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And remember, we start back up tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. The day is dedicated to distance learning and strategies for how to best set up distance learning in the fall. And so we hope that you will be back with us, keynote at 8 o'clock, and then we'll follow a similar format with breakout sessions throughout the day. Thanks so much to our presenters. Candace, you and your team are amazing. We really appreciate you sharing with us today, and everyone have a good evening and hope to see you back tomorrow. Thank you.